Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long-term business survival and success is about creating maximum profit, and the only way you can do that is when you optimize your people in a low-friction context. So that's what we talk about twice a month. We bring in people from out there in the real world that are working on this kind of stuff, and we see what they have to teach us, sometimes their successes and sometimes things they wouldn't do again. But we're going to bring you today Tricia Neves, the founder of Hiring by Design. And she's a nationally recognized expert in talent analysis. Since 1998, she's been helping organizations make hiring decisions and development decisions about their people using science-based talent assessments. These align people with their roles so they can thrive. Her approach consistently improves performance, retention, and team dynamics, often delivering results in just a matter of weeks. And just recently, she became certified in SmartRev, and I'm very thrilled about that, which reinforces her people first, purpose driven approach to creating long term revenue growth. Welcome, Tricia.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for having me.
So I can't tell you how happy I am to have you here right now because in the last it's been obviously since the pandemic, but just in the last 3 or 4 months, it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer that if we don't hire right, all the other things that we try to do with our clients or we try and help other people do, if we don't hire right, none of those get done. And you and I were talking a little bit off camera about this, but so share with us how you got into this business and what it is you've been doing since 1998. And, then I want to kind of dive into this. How do we get the right people? Because it's not just skills.
I actually got into this in a kind of a magical way. I used to be a business director for a landscape architectural firm. Has nothing to do with what I do now. But my superpower, if you will, was on the HR side, where people would come to me for basically coaching about issues they were having in the work environment, their work, our joint work environment. And I really enjoyed that. And that was the area I got the most positive feedback about when I would get reviews or whatever, that was something that I did really, really well. And I've always enjoyed really getting to a point of understanding someone so that I can really have a rich conversation with them about their lives and what they want to do. So fast forward, I was very stressed out at work. I was a single mom with two little boys, and I was working a lot of hours, and I decided that I needed a break. And I basically left my job with 3 months in the bank and had no idea what I was going to do next. Um, and then kind of stumbled upon a gentleman who was using the same talent assessments I'm using today. And he told me all about them. And I was just fascinated by the access to understanding people those assessments gave. And whatever he said to me that day, back in 1998, just fascinated me. And I was riveted by the possibilities of what, having this kind of data would, what kind of doors it would open in terms of connecting with people. So that's when I started. And everything since then has been pretty magical in the sense that every time I introduce this idea to a decision maker, it's immediately interesting to them and adopted by them, not only on a one-on-one basis, but on a broader scale, because it basically gives you access to how people communicate, how they make decisions, and what drives them. And that's something that often takes 30, 60, 90 days for you to really get. about new people that you hire. So that's how I got started, and it's been a fascinating ride since then.
When you do your practice, do you find that the people you work with get as excited as you do about learning about both themselves and others?
Not only do they get excited, they're kind of fascinated by again, the access that these assessments give them. Things that, so let's just say, for example, uh, a decision maker is having an issue with underperformance with a particular individual, and they've tried everything they know how.
Yeah.
And we assess that individual and we identify the blind spot that's in the way of that individual performing. And then it's like flipping a switch. All they have to do is make that one little change and the performance comes through, right? So having that access so quickly is, I think, what especially very busy decision makers are really attracted to.
It almost has to be a relief for them. I mean, when you've worked that hard and you've got somebody that you've obviously invested in, you
Yeah.
hired them or watched them be hired and you knew they were there and you got them for a reason and it's not working out. It's got to be hard because you want them to succeed. And it's got to be a relief when you teach them that one piece they didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about hiring, because I've been thinking a lot about it lately because I'm watching so many of my clients that are struggling, and I see two scenarios, and maybe we can talk about both of them. One of them is I'm literally hiring. I need people I don't have. How should I go at that? What should I be doing that most people aren't doing? And what would you be doing to help me make that a really good hire?
So I always start with the question, what does 80% of the day in the life of the job look like? What are you spending 80% of your time doing? So I'm always going to focus on the natural talent side before I think about, experience, qualifications. Clearly, education is going to play a role from time to time. If you're looking for an engineer, you need an engineering
Yeah.
degree with an engineering degree, right? But when we're just talking about raw talent, I start by asking the question, what are you going to spend 80% of your day doing? Because we want your talent to match that requirement. So, for example, if you're going to spend 80% of your time interacting with people,
Yeah.
you need to have the natural talent trait of interacting with people. And some people are loners and they prefer to spend most of their day, by themselves, maybe working on a computer or something like that. So that person would not be a good match for a job that requires a lot of time with people. It doesn't mean that they're not nice people or they're not
Yeah.
good coworkers. It just means that for that particular job. So I start with that. What does 80% of the day look like? Then I ask, what are the key results that you want this job to produce? So when I say key results, I'm not talking about a job description. Job descriptions are often very, very long
Huh.
and very detailed, almost to the point where, like I've said before, only a superhero can do the job. So what are the, five or six key things that you want the job to produce? And really get clear on what those things are. Sometimes the lack of clarity in a hiring manager's plan to hire is because there's been so much different input into that question that now the people that I call the hiring authority don't agree on
Oh,
what success looks like, right? So identify what those five or six things are. So if you're hiring a salesperson, for example, it may be something like expand our territory by 30% within the year 2025.
okay.
That's a key result. Of course, in order to do that, we have to have all these other things take place in order for the expansion of the territory to happen. But that's details. We just want to know what the result is. What are you going to evaluate that person?
Hmm.
What's the basis of your evaluation in 6 months? So that's the next thing, right? And then once we have those things, then we start to develop an ad or a job description, whatever place you're at the time, to specify the traits in the individual that is going to produce those results and that is going to enjoy that 80% that we talked about. So again, using sales, because sales is such an easy metaphor, people understand what salespeople do, right? So if I'm a salesperson, I need to have a talent for connecting, building relationships, interacting with people at volume. So if
Yeah.
I'm a salesperson, I need to be happy about spending maybe 5 hours out of my day talking to people, right? So we want that. And then with the key results, well, if I'm looking for someone that's going to expand a territory by 30% within this year, I want to know that they can design a sales strategy, that they've had success in the past increasing sales, starting from nothing, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So I can build an ad now that is eliciting those things in very concise ways. The job ad, the job description, they don't need to be voluminous. They don't need to be 2 or 3 pages long. They need to be specific enough so that when I, the candidate, am applying for that job, I have clarity on what you're looking for.
So a lot of that clarity is for the client, not for the hiring people.
Yeah, a lot of the clarity is for the decision maker or sometimes it's going to be talent acquisition, sometimes it's going to be HR, sometimes it's going to be a hiring manager. Whoever is putting together the hiring process or the ad for the hiring process is the person that needs to have that clarity. And they don't always agree on what clarity is
Yeah.
versus other people in the organization.
I got to stop you for a minute because this is really very cool. Um, I had never thought about that 80% rule that you started with. It had never dawned on me that I should think about how I want somebody to perform the majority of the day as part of the criteria. And you used the sales example, and it was interesting when you said the 80%, I in my mind went to a sales example, but I went to a strategic sales example where in my day I spend a lot of time organizing my team. And you use the example of 5 hours, like somebody who's in a call center or a retail environment. And that just made it so critical that 80% look at who you're hiring is so important. And if I was the one hiring a strategic person, I know I need them to be talking to marketing. I need them to talk to engineering and the research group and doing research on who they're going to go call on. But other people might not have known that. So if I just said sales job, we could have had a complete total mismatch.
Yeah.
Is that a frequent scenario?
Um, it is a frequent scenario in the sense that I think that often what hiring managers don't realize, and when I say hiring managers, it's a very broad term that I
Yeah.
use to involve all sorts of people, but they don't realize how that ad is communicating something to the candidate. The candidate may be interpreting the ad to mean that's a match for what I know how to do. They can also be interpreting it, that's not a match for what I know how to do because I don't have those specific words on my resume and not even apply for the job. And therefore, you're losing on who potentially could be a great candidate, right? So I think out of, so let me just back up a little bit. An opening in a company, whether it's a new opening, whether it's a replacement, whether it's um, uh, a new type of job that we didn't have
Yep.
before, right? All of those three things on some level create chaos within the organization.
Yep.
There's a disruption that happens. Depending on how many times that disruption happens over the course of a business's lifetime, the hiring process tends to get adjusted and expanded and amended in so many different ways to adjust to that chaos. And there's no structure to it at some point.
Risk
So,
mitigation.
yes, so job descriptions get reused, ads get reused, or job descriptions get expanded and remodeled or rewritten, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes part of this is how we've always done it kind of behavior, right? So to bring clients back to clarity, I often have to have them completely tear the job apart and build it back up again.
One of the things that's just I can't get out of my head as I'm listening to you is this is a very strategic activity. This isn't a tactical, we do the same thing every time, check the boxes and move forward. It's much more um, thoughtful, much more um, wide in its intention than I think I even realized. Is that accurate?
It's accurate, but it doesn't usually start that way. It usually starts very transactionally.
Oh, I'm sure.
So usually a new client comes to me because they heard about me from somebody else and they have a candidate they want to look at. Can you please assess this candidate's talent traits for us? So that's
Yeah.
the first conversation. And it's during the debriefing of those results that they gradually start to understand that we can use this methodology as, in a much more advanced way, much more strategic way,
Yeah.
because we can, for example, benchmark all of these jobs and have a guideline as to what kinds of talent traits we want in individuals that are going to apply for those jobs. So usually it starts from the beginning very small, and then we go into a more strategic look at how the talent life cycle inside your organization really functions, what happens from hiring to retiring.
It strikes me that when somebody comes to you and they ask you to validate traits, we're at the tactical level of the hire, and we've missed those first two parts you had that seem really, really important, the
Yeah.
80% and the outcomes.
Yes. Yeah. And
So
it
how
does take a little time for the decision maker to come to terms with, we're going to slow down the aircraft carrier and we're going to turn it around gradually and look at the entire talent life cycle inside your organization. For some people, it's in, fits and starts, small little items. For other companies, they want to develop something broader.
in
Depends on how long they've been at it.
in today's world, um, with the amount of change, VUCA, chaos, whatever we want to call it, how do you factor that in, or how do you coach your client to factor that in when they hire? Because, if somebody had hired before the elections, now the person they got might be totally inappropriate with all the change going on.
Yeah.
How do you address that?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, my crystal ball only goes so far. If I knew what was going to change in terms of, let's just take tariffs, for example, which have been um, changing frequently, and therefore companies have to adjust to that. Had I known about that early days, I would have been speaking much more about versatility in candidates and
Yeah.
how they can change gears. But having said that, there are jobs that, being versatile is actually a problem.
Oh, interesting.
There are jobs where you want people to be very much sticking to the straight and narrow, sticking to a structure, sticking to a particular procedure because that's the job. So you
Compliance or
yes, you want
security.
exactly. You don't want those people to be flexible. You want them to be always looking for what can be more perfect than it already is, right? So, so that's why we always have to start with that 80% rule. So it can be 80% of the work day or the work week, but what's my main focus going to be? Um, Now, if we're talking about startups, regardless of what's happening in the world, are, ever chaotic environments where jobs change, people wear three, four, five hats, and then they
Yeah.
give all of those away, keep one, and so on and so forth. If I'm working with a company like that, then when we are looking at a particular candidate, we are going to be addressing all of those questions. So my review of that candidate is now going to be, okay, you're hiring this candidate right now to be these three things. I can tell you that within 6 months, they need to be able to give away these two things,
Yeah.
or else they're going to leave you.
Wow. Well, yeah. One of my, it's a story I tell all the time because it's such a tragic thing to happen. And that is you start your startup, you bring in your brother or sister or best friend, and they help you get it started. And you promise you're always going to be with me, and we're going to give you equity. And 2 years later, you got to fire them because they don't fit anymore, and it ruins relationships and families and all kinds of things. And I don't think we plan for that well.
We don't. And I think that one of the issues is that we as humans don't, we want people to be happy doing
Yeah.
what they're doing. We want them to be happy in their jobs and we want the company to be happy with them. So if happiness is the priority, then that conversation changes a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Um, a woman years ago had me assess, he was sort of, she was a graphic designer and he assisted her. And I was early in my business, and she said, "Well, why don't you assess, so and so for me? Because I'm having some challenges with him." And I did assess him, and then she wanted me to go over his assessment results with him. And so he and I had a little sit down, and we went through the whole assessment. And the reason why he wasn't doing a good job is that he wasn't a good match for the job. That was pure and simple. But I needed to get him across that bridge first because he had a job and I don't think he had plans on quitting his job. So we went through his debriefing, we went through his assessment, and after we were done, he turned around and he said, "I want to thank you because all this time I thought I was just incompetent. And now I realize that this is just not the job for me. I'm never going to get really good at this." And so he went off and looked for another job. So if everybody in the world could have that kind of, seeking happiness as opposed to seeking endorsement, um, I think, it would just be a lot easier for everybody. I mean, we're so fear driven.
But yeah, I want to take that a step farther, and I want to see if it goes at back before the 80%.
Hmm.
And one of the things that's become clear to me in the last few years is everybody talks about we want everybody aligned. Well, I think we stole alignment from the robots in the auto plant, where we align robots or we align software. You know, People don't get aligned, in my observation, unless they're first unified. how do we get people unified to the purpose of the organization? Because just like my skills may not fit this job, my my purpose in life may not fit this company. And is there a way to help match where the company's going and where the people are either thrilled to go or repelled to go before we hire them? Is
Yeah.
that a real thing?
I think it is a real thing. It's very broad though, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I don't see often, it's starting to change a little bit, I think, because of the fact that we have a lot of millennial hiring managers now, right? Even Gen X, where they're doing a better job at promoting what our values are in an ad or whatever. And I'm hearing a lot of hiring managers say to me, well, this candidate wants to work for us because of our values, right? So I think that that's moving in the right direction. Um, so if I know what the company's values are and they align with what I feel, that's going to be an attracting point for me, right? Attraction point. I think where things kind of go off the rails sometimes is that once somebody gets hired, they don't understand the full story of how their particular role feeds into the
Yeah.
overall mission of the organization. So let's just say, and I've got a great story for you about a particular example. Let's just say you're a receptionist. You're fresh out of college, it's your first job. You get a job as a receptionist, and you think your job is just to answer phones and get the mail and, make sure you greet everybody, right? And theoretically, that is your job, right? But what effect does that job have on the overall organization? Most receptionists don't know the answer to that question. So when I was in the landscape architectural business, we worked with a big developer in California, and they were developing most of the Southern California coast. Huge, huge company. And they had this receptionist. She had been with them. The first time I talked to her, she had already been with them for 10 years. And she was never going to leave that job. They paid her a boatload of money. And that's because this woman, first of all, she recognized people's voices. If you called for somebody and that person wasn't available, she knew who else to send you to. If you had an urgent matter that needed addressing right away, you could actually tell her what that matter was and she would know where to send you. She was such an integral part of that organization. She was well known in the building industry. She was going to retire as a receptionist, making a boatload of money. So that's the perfect example of how a job that is typically undervalued in terms of its importance can turn into, I mean, she was an executive player in that
Yeah.
company.
I know a large law firm in Phoenix that the same is true, and the because my wife had worked there many years ago, and the lady was still there many years later, and extremely well paid and valued highly for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do we make that intentional on part of the organization so that we aren't looking down on, you know, in the smart rev work we did, we talked about the challenger customer, and in there, for the salesperson standpoint, it was understand who the mobilizer is in the customer's world, which really means who's that receptionist that gets things done, or who's that young programmer that when somebody says, well, we're going to do an AI project, they're all going to turn to that young programmer and say, what does that mean we do?
Right.
And, how do we make that, um, I guess intentional is the only thing I can come up with where the person can get great value from how important that role really is, and the rest of us don't feel like, we either don't get it or some people look down on those positions. How do we get past that?
Yeah. So I think there's basically three types of companies, very generically. Number one, there's the company that doesn't do a good job at that at all. And they have high turnover, they have disengagement issues, that kind of thing. The second kind of company is the company that does it at the front end. So during the interview, you're going to hear all about how important that role is in the scheme of things. Okay? The third and the best type of company is the company that does that during the interview, during your one-on-ones, during your performance plan. There's always that, light at the end of the tunnel that you're going for. There's always that preview of
Yeah.
what the career path for you can be. Now, one more piece to that. Because we can do talent analysis and we can understand what drives people.
Hmm?
So there's a driver that we can measure that basically measures the shorthand would be ambition, but it's really, do I want to have a ladder to climb? Do I want to have advancement? Do I want to have upward mobility? Right? So there's a measurement for that. Well, what if you're hiring me for something that has none of that? There's no upward mobility. There's
Right.
no, right? So if I'm the hiring manager, I have to now explore what kind of options are there for you who has this driver, who wants upward mobility. I don't have that for you, but what kind of career path can I design for you so that you stay engaged with us?
Hmm.
So companies that do a good job at understanding the talent that they bring on and creating a career path that works for them is the trick. Sometimes that career path is not vertical, it's
Oh,
lateral.
yeah, I can see that.
Yeah,
And when you talk about that, it, does the word person or does personal fulfillment become part of that? I mean, so that
absolutely.
okay,
Absolutely. It's the key to engagement, right? So a lot of companies like to talk about retention. And in my view, retention doesn't exist. There's no such thing. Retention is holding on to people,
yeah,
making them stay with you. But engagement is a whole other.
yeah,
So how do I create a universe for you where you are so engaged in what you're doing that you don't want to go? You want
right,
to stay right here. You want to see the fruits of your labor. You want to see where you can go, right?
yep. And it's interesting when you described it as engagement. I recognize people in past relationships that we worked together, but one of us went someplace else, but we still worked together. The person would go to one of our customers or they'd go to one of our partners, and it was like they just changed desks. You're still
Yeah,
working with them, and some of them I've been working with for 20 years, and we've been in different companies, but we've never quit the engagement part.
yeah, yeah. So if you can create a talent life cycle within an organization that has the least amount of chaos possible, so that talent can flow through the organization from start to finish at whatever length that life cycle is for that individual without creating chaos for you. That would be, in my view, the perfect world. So, what does that mean? I hire this person to do a job for me. There's no upward mobility in the job. Their career path with me is theoretically going to be very short, but they have what I need for that particular career path. And I know that. And maybe they know that. When they go and they create that opening, that process of creating that opening should not create chaos for me because I have a talent lifecycle plan that is going to be the least disruptive possible. So the reason I think companies are so focused on retention is that losing someone creates so much chaos that they just don't want to go through that.
Yep.
It's very disruptive. right? So how can you create a talent life cycle that is not disruptive, that's not chaotic, so that when somebody leaves, it's not so disruptive to hire a new person or to get a succession plan within the organization so you have the next person there already.
How do we get small, mid-sized companies to learn some of these lessons? I mean, the things you're talking about make tremendous sense. And, we've obviously talked about cost of chaos and all the disruption and friction. And so it's a conversation we have all the time. But most people only think about those things when the volcano's in the middle of erupting.
Yeah.
How do we get people to recognize this as part of a strategic plan?
Well, therein lies my role. Um, um, so if I'm working with a new organization, first of all, I need to understand if they even have a talent life cycle to speak of. Do they have any kind of um, strategy around, moving talent through the organization? When somebody leaves a company, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It shouldn't be a surprise to the hiring manager. It shouldn't be a surprise to the, HR. Everybody should know that that person's going to go, whether it's because they were disengaged, whether it's because they're not performing well, whether it's because their spouse has to move to another state. None of that should be a surprise, right? So if it's not a surprise, then I'm prepared.
Right.
I'm prepared because I either have a succession plan for them or I have a hiring process that's going to um, take care of that particular opening efficiently. The way that I don't get the surprise is because I've had those one-on-ones. I've had that development plan. I've had that close interaction with the individual. I understand them because I have this talent analysis about them. I know who they are. That's why I'm not surprised.
Well, it starts out with the fact you listen to and care about people.
That's right. That's right.
So, looking for the easy answer, you gave me a huge takeaway when you talked about the three types of companies. And, to me, that seems like every one of us should figure out how to audit ourselves or have you come in and audit us and tell us which of those three we are.
Yeah.
you know, we know on the revenue science part, if somebody's on the right side of the bell curve and all they care about is the product's good enough, it's cheap, and it's easy to get my hands on, nothing else matters. Well, that's okay. That's what you do. You go do that. But in those other situations, there's more, and nobody wants it to be that cut and dried and that disconnected. How do I? Uh, do you help people identify which of those three they are and how to effectively work in each of those
Yeah.
places?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can come in and do an audit of a company's talent lifecycle. Sometimes it's going to be a full audit of everything from hiring to retiring. Sometimes companies will say, well, our leaders don't know how to interview people. How do we fix that? Which is, by the way, a very common challenge for executives. Executives are good at what they do, running their teams, running their businesses, building businesses. They're not always natural interviewers.
Oh, well, and frequently don't think they want to or have time.
That's right. They want somebody else to take care of it. Or when they do interview the candidate, the interview is very disjointed because they're put in a situation that they're uncomfortable in. So, depending on, I think, the greatest pain of the organization at the time, they'll ask me to look at one thing or another. Sometimes it's just assessing a candidate. Sometimes it's looking at their entire hiring process. Sometimes it's reading a job description. Um, but that's always going to lead to a broader conversation. So when I say okay, you're hiring this person to do this job, and I can forecast for you that unless you have, I actually have an example for this. Um, Client is at the time they had about 350 employees. They were a manufacturing company. They had a sales force, and they also had this job that was like a customer service job. The customer service job basically supported the sales force.
Mhm.
Salespeople would call in, they would get quotes, they'd get product information, that kind of thing, and that was the job.
Yep.
They assessed this woman who wanted a sales job. They didn't have an opening for her. So she applied for the customer service job and was clear to them. I think this is a stepping stone for me to get into the company, but what I really want is that job over there. When we assessed her, it was clear that she was a salesperson, that she wasn't going to have a whole lot of patience for complaining customers, if there were any, or for the job that entailed. It was a very
Yeah.
detail-oriented job, a lot of computer work, that kind of thing. So when I talked to the client about them, I said, how soon is there going to be an opening for her? And they said, oh, it's going to be at least 6, 8 months, maybe a year. I said, she won't last a year. She will leave you. So you either need to have the conversation with her that this job will be available to her in a year, or start training her in sales so that when the job is open, she's ready to roll. It's a company that has a lot of products, so there was a lot of product knowledge information that she had to understand. She left in 4 months. Yeah.
You
So
know,
there has to, so just to answer your question, Rick, sorry, there has to be an ongoing conversation. That's why the one-on-ones are so important.
you know, you and I have had this conversation before. Uh, I've been talking about the cost of chaos for over 30 years, and I've told people how incredibly high it is. But when I started working with you and the other people at TTI, one of the things I realized was the cost of chaos was really substantially people. Whether it was burnout, turnover, disengagement, whatever you want to call it, most of it was some form, maybe bad communication between silos, but it really all came down to people. So when I look at the work you do and I know how to measure the cost of chaos, I just can't believe we can't get you in front of every, CEO or business owner to not only head off the chaos, but to increase the capacity of the people that are there because they're more fulfilled and they're more engaged and they're more creative and innovative and collaborative and all those things that we say we want, but we
Yeah.
have policies that almost never get there.
Yeah.
How do we
Yeah.
do that?
I think that depending on where they're at in their own journey, you know, startups, established organizations, growing companies, depending on where they're at in that stage, it becomes challenging for them to really slow themselves down to the point where they stop and they're willing to completely review a process that they've been into for years and years and years. I find that at least with the clients I've worked with up until now, that it's easier for them to take bite-sized pieces,
Yeah.
address those bite-sized pieces. So if we take the interviewing as an example, we're going to design an interview training for executives. They do that. Or if we're going to look at the more challenging jobs to fill and develop benchmarks for those jobs, or if we're going to look at succession planning, which, by the way, most companies don't have it, and they don't have it for all of the positions,
Right.
not just right.
Yeah.
So if we're going to look at any one of those things, I think it's a lot easier for an organization to take the bite-sized pieces.
When you hooked me on the 80%, that visualization, in the beginning. And I can't measure it right now, but I would guess if people did that, I would guess all of their downstream metrics of burnout and turnover and disengagement would get better if they just did that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's probably no real way to measure it or prove it up front. And so everybody waits till it blows up and then we go fix
Right.
the part that
Yeah.
blew up. So, you know, this has been great. And I knew we were going to have fun with this, and we didn't follow a single thing in the outline.
Right. Right.
So, what would you like to leave us with? What advice do you have for new people coming in, or senior executives that they could be doing or should be doing, or just something you'd like to help people think about that would make a difference?
For me, the commitment to understanding people more deeply moves the needle in every way. If somebody, whether it's your employee, your boss, your coworker, really gets that your goal is to understand them better, everything changes. Everything becomes possible inside of that bubble, if you will. And what talent analysis does, or the talent analyst that I do does, is it gives you the code for that. How to understand your people, how to understand people more deeply. I've worked with organizations who have teams that have been with them for 5, 10 years. And when we do a talent analysis of those people, they're still learning things about those people. So clearly, there wasn't that depth of understanding there. So the first step is committing to that level of understanding. And in order to have that level of understanding, you have to have some kind of an assessment tool because we're always adapting our communications to our audiences. And to order to get the true person, you need to have some kind of a analysis, some kind of a assessment that gives you that information. I, of course, am very partial to TTI's tools. I've been using them exclusively for all of the years I've been in business. Um, but I use those tools because they are just so crazy accurate in their translation of what the candidate puts in to the questionnaire. So that's one. Two is everybody's good at something. Nobody's good at everything. So just really understand what you're good at, maximize that, minimize what you're not good at, and find somebody else to do the things you're not good at. That's the simple, overly simplified way, I guess. Um, but I find that a lot of executives, especially the entrepreneurial business builders, um, want to believe, because they're taking on so many challenges, they want to believe that they can tackle all of the things with the same level of proficiency, like interviewing, for
Yeah.
example. So it's okay not to have that, right? It's okay to not be good at everything, which sounds overly simple, but believe me, I've talked to a lot of executives who stumble a little bit there,
Oh yeah. Yeah. But yes, sometimes our egos get in the way.
myself included. Yeah.
So, and thank you for mentioning the accuracy of the tools that you use, because today there's a million tools out there, and people don't often ask themselves the question, how accurate is this? And is it really been scientifically validated to do what it says it does? And I know, you have great belief in the TTI tools as I do. Uh, and there are some other good tools too, but people today are trying to use AI to replace all of those, or somebody's opinion. So it's just kind of a word to the wise. Make sure what kind of tools people are using to support you.
And if I may, I can give people some guidelines as to, choosing assessment tools, because I've been asked this question a number of times. How do I pick an assessment? Usually, depending on the situation, they're going to pick a tool that's the least expensive. That's usually what they want. And I can understand that. We're all monitoring costs. We're all trying to make a profit, and that's all well and good. The first question I ask is, how much does it cost you to replace this person? Which, by the way, I'm surprised as to how often people don't know the answer to that question because they're only looking at the hard costs of the immediate event, right? So we're going to launch an ad somewhere, we're going to hire a recruiter, we're going to whatever. They're not looking at all the costs associated with that gap.
Yep.
Who else is doing that job? The people that are doing that job, what are they not doing because they're doing that job? And so on and so forth. So there's a whole long list of things. So look at how much you're spending to hire the person, how much you're investing in that. How long is it going to take them to really show promise? So some of my clients who have salespeople, it takes them 2 years to get off the
Oh, yeah.
ground. So, how much is that 2 years worth? So then look at the cost you're paying for the assessment. So that's the first thing. The second thing, look for an assessment that is highly validated. I've looked at assessment tools over the years where there's no validity study on their website. There's nothing. Where if it is, it's a 10-year-old validity study. So TTI validates their assessments every 2 to 3 years in 90 countries and over 40 languages. I like that, right? Because then it gives me the ability to predict performance based on what I'm looking at in terms of the results, right? So look for something that's validated. Look for something that you can understand.
Yep.
If you have to be a PhD to understand an assessment result, maybe that's not the most practical for you, right? So although I do analyze the assessment results with clients, it's a report that's very reader friendly. I mean, you read through it and you understand what it says. My job is to interpret what it says relative to your situation, your job, your work environment, right? So those are the guidelines I would give you. Look for that validity study. Don't look at the cost until you know how much it costs you to replace that job, right? And look for something that you can actually understand. And then ideally, look for something that does more than one thing. So TTI assessments are used for hiring. You can use them for performance analysis. You can use them for training and development. So they're a full scope of applications that you can use once you have that assessment done on the candidate. So look for something that does more than a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yep.
There's
When it's done right, the assessments will go all the way through the life cycle of the person and the organization.
That's right. That's right. And that's the beauty, is that you always have that reference available.
Well, this has been a ball.
Oh,
And
great.
and as often as we've talked before, you taught me a whole bunch of stuff. The three types of organizations I think is super important. And I hope our audience asks themselves where they fit and builds a plan around where they fit. So it's something in their control because managing your people going forward is going to even be more important than it was in the past.
That's right.
So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rick, for having me.
So for the audience, I hope this was as beneficial for you as it was for me. And we'll be back with another one in another 2 weeks. So thanks for joining us.